Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. We're so happy to have you all here with us for the Center for Change webinar series. I'm here with Laura Campbell and so excited to hear her present here shortly. I'll introduce Laura in just a minute. I just want to do a couple of really quick housekeeping items. If you've been on our webinars before, you probably know this drill by now, but if not, we just want to make sure that everybody kind of has an overview about what's going to happen over the next hour. So here we go. A copy of the PowerPoint is in the Handouts section of your toolbar. If you'll look at your toolbar, you'll see a section that says Handouts. There should be 2 of 5 is what it says in there. So there's 2 in there. One is the test, which I'll talk about in a minute. It's just a read only. And then there's a copy of the PowerPoint. So obviously you'll see Laura's PowerPoint as she goes along. If you would like to download the PowerPoint to review later, that's where you would do it. You can also catch that same information on our website at centerforchange.com under our webinars tab. And as I said, a copy of the post test is also in the handout section of the toolbar. This is for reference only. In order to obtain CE credit, you must take the online post test, and I'll talk about that in just a second. You're welcome to submit questions in the questions section of the toolbar. We'll try to get to a few at the end. We just have too many folks, which is a great thing, on our webinars, and so it's difficult to have everybody be able to use their mic and their camera, and so it's just easier if we do questions via the toolbar. So if you'll type those in, I'll keep an eye out for those questions throughout Laura's presentation. And then at the end, we'll circle back and we'll get to a few of those questions as well. Then, when the webinar ends, there will be an evaluation that will automatically pop up on your screen. If you'll take 30 seconds or so to complete that evaluation, that would be really helpful. That's a continuing education requirement for us. It's completely anonymous, so feel free to give candid feedback. We tabulate those results and send those to the CE approval entities. And then about an hour after the webinar ends, you'll receive a separate email from GoToWebinar with the link to take the online post test. That email will look similar to the one that you received when you registered initially. And so take a look for that. Again, about an hour after the webinar ends, that will come. Okay, I think that's all of our housekeeping items. Now I'm so happy to turn it over to Laura Campbell. Laura is the program director for Center for Change Boise, our location in Idaho. She's an LCPC, she's a registered clinical supervisor, and I know that that's a piece of her professional life that she really enjoys and is really phenomenal at. She's her supervisees, I don't think that's the right word, Laura, but go with it for me if you would. The folks that she supervises love her and really speak so highly of her valuable contribution to their learning and growth. So we're so happy to have Laura here with us today. I am excited to learn from Laura today about third culture kids. This is a new topic for me and perhaps for some of you, so I'm looking forward to that. So with that being said, Laura, I'm going to send it your way, so give me just 1 second to change the sharing and change the presenter. Oops, that's giving me fits, so give me just 1 second. There we are. All right, Laura, it's coming your way.
Okay, and I'm gonna click, well, actually, I guess I'd like to just say hi to everyone first, and thank you so much for coming, and I'm so excited to be doing this today. I'm gonna be sharing about working with and the cultural components around third culture kids, the features of this culture and considerations working with this population. And then we're going to touch on work around ambiguous grief, loss, and then also development. So I'm going to hit show my screen now. Is that right, Tamara?
Yes, perfect.
Okay.
Yep, I'll keep an eye for it and we'll get you up and running and then I'll pop out.
Perfect.
Perfect. You're up and fully expanded, so you're ready to roll, Laura. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my mic and my camera, but if you need me, I'm right here. I'll just pop back on. Otherwise, I'll see you at the end of the presentation and we'll go over some questions.
Sounds great. Thank you. Okay. I'm just going to assume everyone can see what they need to see and hear what they need to hear, and feel free to put something in that text bar if you can. So I am, just so folks know, well, let's see if I can make this. All right, here we go. There we go. I have some disclosures I want to share with you and potential conflicts of interest. Basically, I am employed by Center for Change, and I have no other conflicts of interest that I am aware of. So we can just move on. A little bit about me, just so you know who I am. Thank you, Tamara, for that lovely introduction. I listed out all the places where I have lived in my life. I might have missed a couple, but just so folks know and have some context for what we're going to be talking about today, I was born in Oaxaca, Mexico. I spent a few years in Huntington Beach, California. I spent most of my developmental years in Colombia. Scattered in there, I had a year in Michigan. I moved to Indiana for college, lived there for a number of years, and then transitioned to Boise, Idaho about 6 years ago at this point. The other things I put on there is I put the number 9 because I attended 9 different schools between kindergarten and 12th grade. I received a bachelor's of arts from Taylor University in art and Spanish, and then my master's and my ed specialist degrees are from Indiana University. I was a former school teacher, transitioned over into counseling, so I've had 15 years of clinical experience, which I have really enjoyed and continued to learn so much and grow so much. My focus has been on really addiction treatment, recovery, dual diagnosis treatment, group processes. I love group. And then most recently, eating disorder treatment is an area that I'm developing expertise in. And then I always feel like we're asked, what do you do for fun? So I will tell you, I love movies. I love parenting my teenagers. I love adventurous cooking and eating, and that includes shows about cooking and eating, and then I'm a big animal fan. So the picture on the top is one of my earliest pictures from when I lived in Mexico. That's me with my older sister. And the one below is a current, more recent photo of our 2 therapy dogs at Center for Change Boise. So that is Chloe and Becky, and they get a lovely shout out because they are 2 amazing animals that our patients get to enjoy on a weekly basis. Okay, so learning objectives today. I would love us to expand our cultural sensitivity, understanding, and competence related to identifying and working with third culture kids. And we'll talk about who might be in that group and how they might identify or how they might not identify. We're going to spend a little time at the end talking about potential trauma and loss that may show up in culturally diverse patient populations. And again, I'm going to focus on third culture kids, but you may be able to extrapolate that out to other folks that you work with or have worked with in the past. And then we'll spend a little time talking about strategies that we as providers and as organizations can employ to make sure that we are providing effective trauma-informed and culturally responsive treatment. So initial disclaimer, I am not an expert on all things third culture kid related. I do have some expertise in some areas. This is certainly a focus of treatment that I'm both personally and professionally interested in. I continue to learn and grow and evolve in my understanding and practice. And please know, I am open to alternate thoughts. If there's more information out there that you're aware of, I'm not, I would love to understand and know what that is. And I really do believe that ongoing learning is a lifelong process. So the short answer to the question, what's a TCK, a third culture kid, is that they are individuals who have lived outside of their passport country during developmental years. And that's a pretty brief and cut and dry definition. We'll get into a little more of a complex definition as we go. I think most of us are aware that with ongoing globalization, movement, people shifting jobs, moving across country, lines get blurred, and even though we're talking about folks specifically who are living outside their passport country, I think most of us could look at the United States itself and say there are multiple cultural areas within the United States. And so folks who haven't even left the United States may have still some features that really relate to being a third culture individual. So I was even thinking as I was starting to prepare for this webinar a little bit ago, wow, which of my patients kind of map with some of the things we're going to be talking about today. And I noticed that I was working with 3 folks who may not identify as third culture kids, but certainly have some features of living in between spaces and in between cultures. Okay, so just as a reference, this is a cultural identity model that's really looking at how we tend to categorize folks. So what we're going to be focusing on today is that quadrant that says hidden immigrant, or also invisible minority is a term, and that's someone who looks similar to the culture that they're in, but they may not think or behave the way that the folks in that culture do. So a perfect example of that is that in Vietnam, during the Vietnam War, a lot of folks left Vietnam and went to the United States. And when folks left who were kids, they were actually raised in the US, Texas, California, you name it, folks settled there. And they had left in the 70s. And as adults now, they've decided to return there. So they're a perfect example of that hidden immigrant model of, by their appearance, you would assume that they'd be Vietnamese, having lived and raised in Vietnam, but the truth is, they had a very different cultural experience coming back to a place that they may consider home, or they may not consider home. So that's one example of a hidden immigrant. We're going to talk about third culture kids as another example of that hidden immigrant category. Okay, so just as a way to sort of hang a framework on what we're going to talk about today, we're talking about third culture kids in terms of who you might be seeing, who shows up in your office or who shows up in your treatment facility. But there are lots of complex and minority cultures and folks who identify with specific identities that we may not observe initially because they're not necessarily a visual identity. So that might include individuals with minority religious affiliations or cultural backgrounds that either we're not familiar with or that are just in a minority in their community, individuals with minority sexual or gender identities, individuals with less visible disabilities, veterans, international adoptees, and that especially is true when folks are maybe adopted from a country where they may present as looking similar to the culture they've been adopted into, but they may not feel like they're part of that culture. And then we're going to be talking today about third culture kids. A lot of names I tagged in there. I'm just going to go ahead and read them off because in the literature and in the research, third culture kid is really the term that gets used, but you'll see some other ones as well. So you might get third culture individual, TCI, cross-cultural kids, CCKs, and then bicultural individuals and global nomads fit in somewhat into these categories too. You can tell right away that this is just a group of folks that tend to live in between spaces. Let's move on. So here's a little bit of definition that expands a little bit on the original one. So David Pollock was an anthropologist and sorry, take that back. And he was a sociologist, sociologist, and he did a lot of research on this space where people are living sort of between cultures. And his definition is a person who has spent a significant part of his or her developmental years outside of the parent's culture. The TCK frequently builds relationships with all the cultures while not having full ownership in any. Although elements from each culture may be assimilated into the TCK's life experience, the sense of belonging is in relationship to others of similar background. And that last part is really important. So here's folks who have taken pieces and really identify with pieces from different cultures, but their sense of belonging is often in this relationship to others as opposed to a very specific place. So you can tell it's a little more complex than the original definition. So why a training on and focus on third culture kids? Well, let me tell you a few facts. So first of all, the term expatriate. So these are Americans who have gone out of the United States to live in another country, but the expectation is they're returning. That's different than an immigrant, where the expectation is they are settling in that country. So an expat is someone who's leaving for some time, but is planning on coming back. Those numbers continue to increase. We don't measure who is currently out of the US very well. The Census Bureau tried to do that at one point, I think in 2004. Basically what they came up with was it didn't work very well. They weren't able to get those numbers. So really those numbers are pretty much based on voting. So folks who vote overseas, that's how they get counted. Estimates recently were between 7 and 9 million Americans are living abroad, and about 4.5 million children are in English language schools abroad. Now, that doesn't mean those are all American kiddos overseas. What it does mean is that a lot of Americans are living all over the world. So some of those folks are kids with American passports who will come back to the United States, and some of those folks will end up in our programs and our treatment facilities. And we know that mental health treatment is increasingly accessed both by internationally mobile folks and by folks who are more aware of their mental health needs than ever before. For us as providers, this increases our understanding and just in multicultural competence, intelligence, and then effective practice. And hopefully some of what we'll learn today can be used with other folks as well, because some of what we're learning today is about living in between spaces. So with expats, most families return home at some point. Often they return home when their kids are college age. Often they return home after a 3-year or 4-year stint. And so when they do return to the United States, that's often when they show up in our offices if they're struggling. Also, as a provider, you might decide to work overseas. So you might be attached to an international school. You may decide to work on an American base somewhere. And so I don't know what your plans are, but I would encourage you to look into that if you're adventurous and curious, because there's certainly a need around the world for providers in an international setting as well. And then, like I said before, as a provider, you may find some of these conceptualizations useful, especially around loss and transitions and grief with a range of clients, not just with third culture kids. Okay, so let's dig in a little bit about who are these people and where are they hanging out, and then how do they sort of show up in their different spaces. The most common groups of third culture kids tend to be with the military. So a lot of US bases, a lot of families going to US bases, and usually those are for set amounts of time. We also have non-military, but government, State Department, so that might look like embassy folks. We also have a lot of people in healthcare, community development, international aid, education. So that might be a K through 12 school that's an international school, but it might also be a university. And then business is a large piece of the expat community, so businesses that have sent families overseas. And the other large group is that religious piece. So those would be missionary families who typically are spending long amounts of time overseas. And those kids are usually referred to as MKs. So if you come from a religious background, most of you know the PK term is for a pastor's kid or a preacher's kid. They have kind of their own unique culture in some ways. And then MKs, missionary kids, also have a very unique culture. So if we were going to look at actual numbers of minors with American citizenship that are living abroad, and some of these folks have multiple citizenships. Some of these have parents, one who's American, maybe one is another nationality. We're looking at a very rough estimate of about 250,000 minors at any given time, somewhere not in the United States. I don't know how COVID's impacted these numbers, so that's a huge question, but certainly that was the numbers a few years ago. And then, like I said, The United States really has its own cultural diversity within its borders. So there's some discussion about, can you be a third culture kid never having left the United States? And a lot of people would argue, absolutely, absolutely, because of the cultural diversity and the experience of multiple moves doesn't necessarily have to be across an official border. So because globalization and cultural complexity continues to expand, I just want folks to be aware that this is in some ways, this is a category with very fluid boundaries and very fluid lines. And so as I'm talking today, please keep that in mind, because it's not a perfect, either or situation. And we'll talk about that a little more too. Here's a dilemma. And this is kind of a snapshot of a third culture kid dilemma. This is from Unique. She says, I look like an American. I sound like an American. I'm a Black American with a 15-year European experience since I was 9. Blacks can't understand me. Whites can't understand me. Germans are wondering how I understand them. And the British are saying, you don't sound like us. And so speaking of that idea of struggle for identity, both of self and then also that external perception of who am I, where do I fit in, how are others seeing me, and where do I fit? So the questions become, like, what happens when your own identity is formed, but it's not understood or recognized by the environment you're in? Or alternately, you could say, what happens when you're working on developing your identity and societal rules keep changing, and so that identity becomes difficult to sort of nail down for individuals. Let's dig in a little bit more into common third culture histories. So a big portion of third culture kids come from the military. Most of you have probably interacted with folks who have been connected with the military at some point, just because that's a large percentage of the population. We call them Army brats, Navy brats. This is really not a pejorative term. I do check in every time I am working with someone who is connected with the military, and I say, hey, how do you feel about the term brat? And across the board, they're like, I'm super proud of it. I think most recently we had a patient who was explained to me in great detail how as soon as she turns 18, she is getting a tattoo that says Navy brat, because that is very much of her identity. And so just a little fun fact, the term brat comes from the phrase British Regiment Attached Traveler. That was something that was assigned to families of British troops. They shortened that. And so that term has been used with any of the military groups associated, and really is a point of pride and connection for that group. So just if you aren't as familiar with this group, they typically often have 2 to 4 year assignments. So families are often moving multiple times. That might depend on assignment. That might also depend on if a parent receives a promotion. That can really shift where they go and where they live. They generally do live on or near foreign military bases, but not always. Some of the larger bases have schools, they have commissaries, they have very much kind of their own programs. And so it really depends on what folks are doing, which bases they're at, which communities they're in. But often they're very tight-knit communities. Children may share very similar experiences with other brats, even if they've never been to the same, excuse me, same countries, even if they never relocate overseas. And grab a drink really quick. Okay, I think I'm back. All right. Another large category of third culture kids that ends up coming from business. So some of the large ones are oil, tobacco, technology, import, export, but this can really expand beyond that, typically called business kids. They're more likely to live in multiple countries, although sometimes they'll have a one stint and then return back. They typically have high interaction with host countries, but not always. And that host country interaction may be broad or narrow. So it can really range. Typically, you would consider most of these folks living a fairly privileged lifestyle, but again, not always. All right, our other 2 categories are kind of the non-military, government, healthcare, education. We touched on that. Foreign service brats, diplomat kids. This might be embassy families, DEA, ed kids, folks connected to NGOs. Again, they often do family term commitments of 2 to 4 years, and they often have structured supports when they go overseas, but not always. The 2 to 4 year commitments are an interesting thing. We'll get to that if we have time. The last large group of third culture kids is that religious organization. So missionaries who are going internationally, they typically spend the most time overseas. So 85% of missionary kids spend more than 10 years of their developmental years in foreign countries. And of all third culture kids, they generally have the most interaction with local communities and the least interaction with people from their own passport country. And again, that interaction might be very narrow and very specific, or it might be very broad. Another dilemma. So Bryce says, I'm from Ottawa. Actually, that's a lie, but that's the answer I give to acquaintances. My father is half French and half Vietnamese peacekeeper, and my mother's Ethiopian. And where do I belong? I'm not French, Vietnamese, Ethiopian, or Canadian. And I would say that those are very different places around the world, but we could say something similar to someone who, again, has never left the United States, but has multiple connections to multiple cultures and people within just the borders of our United States. Another dilemma. This is from Abby. She says, so when I'm in Singapore, I say I'm from Chicago, Seattle. And when I'm in America, I say I'm from Singapore. So already she's, got a little bit of a living in between spaces. When I would meet a true blue Singaporean in college, I would get nervous because then I would have to explain my life story and why I had an American accent and couldn't speak Singlish, why I wasn't truly Singaporean. So again, that sense of being sort of in between spaces without really one single easily identifiable identity, cultural identity. So back to that definition of, although elements from each culture may be assimilated into the TCK's life experience, that sense of belonging is in relationship to others actually of a similar background. That may be family, that may be peers who have a similar understanding of this culture. Let's talk about some commonalities. And some of this we're going to breeze through because we don't need to spend a lot of time on this, but a lot of third culture kids report feeling out of sync with their passport country peers. They feel like they've got a pretty good understanding of cultures and different cultures, maybe better than the average American. Most report feeling deeply connected to the countries where they've lived, and also are aware that that's probably not going to be where they stay. They have the expectation often of returning home. Doesn't always happen, but that's the expectation. This tends to be a very highly educated population. Most have grown up with a cultural expectation that they will go to college. Almost 90% attain college degrees. Interestingly enough, though, it often, for about half of them, it takes going to 3 different universities before they earn that degree. And then almost 30% of third culture kids actually end up with an advanced degree. So highly educated population for the most part. Also, they're fluent in more than one language, which makes sense. They often are well-traveled, comfortable with a cross-cultural lifestyle. They also feel quite nationalistic, often about multiple places where they've lived. Some of this data, when we touch on this, is a little bit older. This is not a huge population, so some of the data was collected a while ago, but pre-COVID, the comparisons gave us information that TCKs tend to be at higher risk for depression and suicide than their peers if we look at those numbers. And then many times have a story that is really maybe not traditional in terms of used to frequent moves, frequent school changes, leaving homes regularly, leaving friends and pets regularly, having frequent deployments that may not affect their movement, but may impact a parent's deployment. And that might be both parents or that might be one parent. And they'll report they're generally excellent at following cultural cues, blending in, and disappearing into the woodwork. And that's important because what third culture kids are really good at is not standing out. So you may be working with someone, you may have worked with someone that as we're talking today, you go, oh, maybe that was what was part of what was going on with them. Really, this population is really not necessarily looking to stand out as much as they are looking to fit in often in the community they're in. And they've learned how to do that very well, but that doesn't always serve them. And we'll talk about why that is. Okay, so just a couple more things. Tend to be really good at calculating time differences and money conversions. It's just something you grow up with. Are very used to relationship connections that are not physically present. So family that they may only have seen a couple times in their life, but still feel those connections. They can really struggle with making and keeping deep connections, and we'll talk about that a little more. Just on a practical level, you know, things are not really designed for international communication still. So often, you know, forms will ask for a permanent address. Third culture kid will struggle with that, especially if they need to put down an address that really doesn't even fit in the box that that address is requesting. And often we'll have a life story that uses the phrase, and then we moved. And this could be 5, 6, 12 times because of this population's mobility. Let's see. So some benefits of that third culture experience, and again, thinking about who these folks are and maybe where they show up in your practice, is they do identify a high cross-cultural competency and cultural intelligence. They do tend to have varied relationships across cultures. They've learned how to be adaptable, whether that's in travel, relationships, just life experiences, trying new things, being comfortable in new situations. And they say a benefit of having this experience is a global education. There's also some significant differences. So as you're, again, conceptualizing maybe someone you've worked with or someone that you are currently working with, there is not a one size fits all here. So they may desire to settle down or stay highly mobile. They may or may not really identify with what we call their passport country, so their country usually of origin or their parents' origin. They may view their experiences as very positive or negative or both, and we'll talk about that a little more too. They may adapt everywhere and have figured out how to do that well, or they may be really struggling to adapt anywhere. This is a good one as clinicians for us to pay attention to. They may or may not have had extensive exposure, education, experimentation related to drugs and alcohol. So you may have someone who's had a very conservative upbringing, a very carefully constructed upbringing where they were protected from a lot of information exposure, or did I say experimentation? I think I did. Or you may have someone who has had a lot of exposure to drugs and alcohol, and so depending on the individual, whether they tend to be an experimenter or not, that may really impact what that's like for them coming back to the United States or being in the United States in those different environments. And they might rely on significant local family and social support, or they may not have that, and that may be a necessity or a choice. And then finally, they may or may not have a good understanding of American culture and history. So when we talk about that and some of these, I'm also reminded of a patient that I worked with. She had never been out of the United States. I worked with her in a university setting. She'd been raised in a fundamentalist family and a fundamentalist community in Arizona. So very different experience. However, she really related to some of these experiences, not sure whether she should settle down. She didn't feel like the roots that she had put down as a child were really available to her. She did not have a good understanding of the broader American culture, songs, music. She wasn't familiar with movies. Her educational experience had been very uneven, so she was very well educated about some things. She was also raised in a community that practiced polygamy. So as she would say, I am not great first date conversation material. She would talk about, she had 3 moms, she had over 20 siblings. She's like, there just aren't questions on a first date that work well with that tell me about your family conversation. So I just want to bring her story in a little bit to say, yes, third culture kids are really looking at cultures outside the US, but I would also argue that that very much happens within the boundaries of the United States as well. Okay, so let's move into kind of more of the clinical considerations. So Ruth Van Ricken is a researcher and a presenter and a trainer on third culture issues. And she says the issue is that transition always involves loss, no matter how good the next phase will be. Loss always engenders grief, and the greater you have loved a situation or place or people, the greater the grief. And this really encapsulates some of the things that third culture kids and really any highly mobile person often struggles with. So let's talk about some of the risk factors that show up with third culture kids. So one thing is identity crises. So these occur frequently. They don't have to be long-standing. They can be, but often third culture kids have lived abroad while they're working on that developmental task of identity formation, and that can work out okay for them, or it can really be a challenge. And so that is very individual for each person and where they're at and how they move through those developmental tasks and how their family supports that. But a common risk factor of a third culture kid is certainly identity crisis. These show up typically when third culture kids are expected to repatriate. That means go back to their passport country. So they might do fine all the times that they're moving and traveling and transitioning. It's when they come back and are expected to either settle down or to join in with a community that they thought was their home community, and then they realize when they get there that they don't really feel like they fit into that community, and sometimes the community does not see them for who they really are. So that culture shock during repatriation can really be unexpected. It can be unexpected for the family. It can be unexpected for some members of the family. So some folks do great with the transition and others don't. So that can be an interesting transition for folks as they're moving around and then back to their passport country. For some, that cultural rootlessness and cultural homelessness can really persist and become a risk factor that becomes more chronic than it is temporary. We kind of touched on this already, but this idea of just adjustment struggles, right? So trying to figure out where you're, where you fit into the world. A lot of third culture kids identify that they can make new relationships very quickly, but they also tend to bail on new relationships very quickly. So that tends to be something that's true for third culture kids. Alternatively, some folks approach any new relationship with a lot of caution, hesitancy. What I'll hear sometimes from folks is, why would I make friends if I'm just going to leave again? And again, this isn't exclusive. You don't have to have crossed our borders. If you have had a lot of transitions in your life, I think that will be a similar frustration for some folks as they give up trying. So there's another piece I think that's worth touching on is sometimes third culture kids have difficulty engaging in their passport country, and some of this is due to maybe some arrogance of, look, I've got all these experiences in my life, and I don't see the culture that I'm joining matching me with my cultural awareness and my culturally informed worldview. There may be feelings of disloyalty. So for example, I grew up in Mexico and Colombia. Both those countries have kind of a mixed relationship with the United States. Coming back to the United States, it's can be an interesting transition to decide how you feel about that and where that loyalty rests between cultures and countries. So what all of this sort of rolls around into is that sometimes we can get, and I bolded these, uneven maturation, asynchronous development, and prolonged adolescence. because for those of you who are always taking notes on how to write effective treatment plans, how to conceptualize your patients, these are some really great words to use when they apply. So the idea of uneven maturation. Some areas folks might be very mature, very competent, very capable. In other areas, they haven't had the opportunity to go through that maturity process or developmental stage. Asynchronous development, basically another way of saying that. And then the idea of that prolonged adolescence. They're just maybe not quite where other people are in their age group. They're just requiring more time to get through their adolescent development. So let's look at some considerations related to the idea of loss that Ruth Van Ricken talked about. So the risk factors that are about developmental stages and working to sort of find who you are in the world and how you relate to others. That's the one area. And then we have this other area that is this idea that loss and separation, often happening again and again, can lead to unresolved grief. And it's a little tricky because when we think about grief, typically we think of very specific instances and maybe somebody dying or somebody that you really care about having to leave and having to have that relationship separate. And that can be true, but there's also a lot of other loss and separation that happens with movement. What's tricky about this too is when it's ambiguous. It's not always seen, it's not always named. Family members are not always experiencing the same loss in the same way. And it can also go unaddressed from move to move to move. So family, even within a family, people may be having very different experiences. Some folks may be really leaning into and enjoying the different processes. Others may be really struggling. That grief, that ambiguous piece is tricky because it can look like a lot of different things that don't get named. It can look like a loss of safety. It can look like a loss of trust. It can look like a loss of personal identity. If you're an adult that goes overseas, your personal identity has pretty well solidified. That's not up for debate. But if you're young and you're moving, sometimes that idea of who you are in this world is something that you're really working on, and that can get tricky if you keep moving. And the spaces you keep moving into are giving you different information. Trauma can happen with loss and multiple moves. Again, though, it can look different than what we're expecting. So it might look like evacuation. Your family had to leave abruptly. It might look like living into or in proximity to a war zone. How do you really talk about that with your friends in the US? That's not something most folks chat about over coffee. It might look like natural disasters. Monsoons or typhoons. It might look like chronic political instability. These are things that don't always get named, but really can relate to or really rest in that space of loss, separation that can lead to unresolved grief. And then most commonly, there's this idea that broken attachments happen, but in some of these communities, they're seen as normal. And so folks don't talk about them. They don't get addressed. They don't get named as folks are moving from place to place. So for us as providers, I think some of these are useful concepts to think about. Most TCKs report very low scores on ACEs in terms of childhood events, but they do alternately report high potential for exposure to specific traumatic events. Where this gets a little complicated is that you start to add some other mental health concerns too. So if you take anxiety and depression and then mix this in, it's really hard to tease out sometimes which is what and what are you looking at. And then you add to that too, sometimes there's family dysfunction. And that can be really hard, again, to tease out. Often families are very nuclear. So families move and they're leaving relationships. And so that dysfunction gets masked or missed and just keeps replicating in different locations. There's also this other piece that I think is really interesting. And this is the idea of there's this fear of denying the good. So if I say this wasn't a perfect experience for me, then I'm basically saying it was a bad experience. It's that very black and white thinking of I have to identify this as a good thing. Specifically, I would say in military and missionary families, there's a sense of calling, sense of vocation, this sense of family values around God and country, and there can be a very strong push to make it all about good experiences, all about the positives, and then that leaves out this space of, so what do I do with the feelings that are maybe not as comfortable? Or what do I do with what's hard because nobody's talking about that? And I would say those two groups, military and missionary communities, that probably shows up the most. And that idea too of I have no right to complain, right? If you think of those two organizations, they tend to be kind of, stiff in your backbone and stiff upper lip type organizations. So things that might not get talked about would be repeated loss of community, loss of status. As a kid, you work hard to figure out where you exist kind of in your community, and you may lose that every time you move. Loss of pets and possessions, and that can happen repeatedly. And then that idea of loss of role models, relationships, people you've really built relationships with or who you look up to, and then losing that repeatedly can become exhausting and sometimes lead to unresolved grief. Okay, it's not all bad news. I don't want you to think it's all bad news. There's some real resiliency built into some of this that folks report. There's a lot of increased awareness of transitional stressors. And so even for folks, again, who are not third culture kids, but who are part of a highly mobile world and who have moved multiple times, there are a lot more informal and formal supports and resources over the last 25 years. There's an organization called Families in Global Transition, and that's a very active community. It has all sorts of training. They do an annual training. They also have all sorts of active groups within that for families exactly who are in highly mobile transitional environments. There's been an increase in annual conferences, re-entry seminars for folks coming back to the United States for college. There are books, there are websites, there are even specialized therapists who work with this population specifically. And let's be honest, this population tends to be highly educated and well-resourced, and that's great news. It means they can access services when they need them. Typically, close-knit families and communities are part of their support system. It's not always true, but often it's true. Technology in this case is our friend. It's really helped with providing ways to maintain connections, relationship, to share data, share experiences. And now we're moving into second and third generation families of cultural global nomads, third culture families, and so they continue to add to that understanding and assisting of next generations, and that's where the global families and global transition group fits in well. And then also finally, colleges are really placing increased emphasis on multicultural organizations, housing, global awareness, global education, and that fits well with that global perspective for a lot of students who may be third culture kids but coming back to college in the United States. So some good, so let me keep moving. So I wanted to just toss this screen in here, mostly because I'm talking about trauma-informed care every chance I can get. But as we think about this population that I'm talking about today, I just want you to keep in mind thinking about, okay, in my work and in my organization, how does this fit into these principles of trauma-informed care that we're also working to infuse our organizations with? And so I just want to do an unsolicited promo for, let's all remember the key principles of trauma-informed care that are safety, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, which is significant for this group, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, cultural, historic, and gender issues. So many of these things fitting well into the topic of how do we meet folks where they're at and how do we help them connect and find support in a way that is useful to them. All right, let's see, how are we doing on time? Oh, we can do this. Tips for practice. Couple suggestions. One is, really notice when a client or patient pauses or partially answers a question. For third culture kids or highly mobile populations specifically, this is going to be related to background. And I would say don't necessarily dig into it, but definitely put a flag in it and be curious about it, because there's usually more of a story. When somebody struggles to answer something, it's usually because it's a little more complex and doesn't lend itself to an easy answer. If you know you're working with a third culture kid or someone who's highly mobile, consider asking about where they've lived initially, rather than jumping into where they're from or what's troubling them. We can often go through that list really quickly of our intakes, right? Like all the questions, and those are really good questions. I've often appreciated having those templates because things come up that I would not necessarily have known to ask about. But also, if you notice with a specific individual or patient that they have a highly mobile background, to explore that can be really useful clinically. Within that, you can use this history of mobility chart. I have an example of one. You can make your own, but it's just a great way to sort of kind of timeline out what is their history of mobility, because often that's significant to their life story. And then I would encourage providers to assess for loss, both traditional and ambiguous. And if there's a lot of moves in there, to ask specifically about things left behind. And then assess for depression, suicidality. That's just good clinical care. Also, gonna toss in here, we talk a lot about building resilience with all our patients. For third culture kids, these really relate as well. Three main components. So identifying and establishing and investing in social support. So that may be a real struggle for a third culture kid. The idea of they may not have a lot of social supports, or they may have them and just need help understanding how they really invest in them and maintain them. Getting back to normalcy. What does that mean for someone who's been highly mobile and has never lived in a place for longer than a few years? That may be what some of your work is exploring. What is that? What is normal for you? And what normal is for you now may not be what it was before, and it may not be what it is in your future. And then a really important part of working with this demographic is also meaning making, making sense of this experience. For many folks, there are complicated and convoluted messages and histories around this. And so pulling that apart, deconstructing it, understanding it and how it applies to individuals is a really important part of the work with folks who are third culture kids coming in and needing help. Some other tips for practice, really helping to recognize and put language to the possibly paradoxical nature of this experience. So many folks come in and they don't have the language for what they're working through and experience. And so we can really help with that as clinicians, especially those dialectic skills, which I love. It's not either or, it can be both and. Evaluating for substance use and abuse, always useful. Expressing curiosity about who and what they identify as, support, and what does this look like in terms of how they stay connected. Again, noticing what is not talked about, and then really checking for current effective supports and helping them expand that community as we're able to. This is an example of that cycle of mobility chart. So again, you're welcome to use this one, but you can easily make your own. This one looks at home countries and host countries, and also time living with parents, times living maybe away from parents. So that's often in a boarding school environment, which is very common with third culture kids. For someone who hasn't left the United States, you might just modify this to be, the different locations where they've lived. You can still use that as a mobility chart. It would just look a little bit different. Okay, that's pretty much all the information I wanted to relay today. I did want to just say thank you so much for coming and listening. If you have questions, follow up, that's more than what you can put in a chat, don't hesitate to reach out to me. Here's my email. And then I think Tamara probably is going to help me take it from here, and there may be some questions or some comments real briefly. So
yes, I'm here. So you don't need to do anything, Laura. I'll just talk. and
Fabulous.
read some questions to you. So yes, we've got several questions. We'll get to a couple of them before we have to go. There's one I didn't want to leave this person out and just want to point them in the right direction. So bear with me because I'm not sure that I'm saying the right thing. So Madeline is asking, if one were to leave the country for a time, do you have information about how our licenses could be used? And I would imagine they just need to check with their specific licensing board. Is that correct, Laura?
Yes, that's a great question. And I would say every licensing board is going to have their own rules. Also, that country may have their own rules. And I'll be honest, I'm not an expert on what that is, but my guess is wherever you're practicing has their own expectation for what you need to have in terms of licensing.
That makes sense to me. Thank you. Okay, Lisa asked, would refugees be considered third culture kids?
Really good question. So yes and no. You might be able to tell from what we talked about today, some of what a refugee faces is so similar, right? This idea of these different cultures and their parents' home culture is not going to match their home culture. So in that sense, absolutely. In other ways, I would say someone who is a refugee has a very unique of their own experience in terms of they cannot necessarily go back to their home country. It's not that they're out of their home country for a specific amount of time with the expectation of returning. They're really making their own life for themselves. So the short answer is, I would say, I think that's that Venn diagram where we're starting to find similarities and differences between groups. But a lot of the material I talked about around grief and loss and identity formation, that is absolutely going to apply to that refugee population as well, for sure.
Got it. Thank you. Okay, Sheila is asking, what are common diagnoses that third culture kids would get diagnosed with? And in parentheses, Sheila said adjustment disorder, etc., with a question mark.
Yeah, absolutely. So adjustment disorder is by far the most common one. And that's where, you may start with that. And then depending on where they are going and how they progress, or maybe what you discover as more complex challenges, you might find something deeper or more complicated. Often though, remember I said they're very good at sort of finding ways to just integrate into cultures. I'll say something I find often is substance abuse is a huge piece of the puzzle. They've just figured out ways to sort of make sure it doesn't show up and present as forward for them. But that's another one I would really assess for, is the substance abuse and substance use disorders.
Thank you. Okay, Rebecca said, and you touched on this next one a little bit, Laura. I just want to know if there's anything you wanted to add to it, because Rebecca said you talked about TCK black and white thinking. I'm wondering if you use dialectical behavioral therapy to help with understanding two opposing things can be true. Do you find this modality helpful with TCK community? And you said a little bit about it, but I want to know if there's anything you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, I love DBT, y'all. If any of you who are on who know me, DBT is something I find super useful. So absolutely, Rebecca, such a useful experience, especially, let me give you an example. So let's take someone who maybe their parents were missionaries, right? And so they have this concept of we're going overseas and this is a higher calling and we're doing this for reasons that we fundamentally believe in. Well, let's say they have an experience where they're emotionally or sexually abused. In the midst of that similar experience, those messages are so difficult to unravel and to tease apart. Parents might not even be aware. Parents might be aware and not know what to do. Parents might handle it poorly. And that's a situation where DBT can be so useful to start teasing out what was that experience like for that individual and how do they conceptualize that.
Thank you. Excuse me. Okay, Charles is asking, wondering if English as a second language teachers routinely consult with school counselors regarding progress of third culture kids.
Okay, that's a great question. Okay, let me see if I got that right. So ESL teachers consulting with who?
School counselors regarding the progress of the third culture kid.
Man, I hope they do, because that's genius, right? Like
right?
would be. I have no idea. So I have a degree in school counseling as well. I've never used it. So I wish I could give you more, but if any of you, yeah, have a way to facilitate that, I say go for it, because that sounds very useful.
That'd be awesome, wouldn't it? Right?
Phenomenal.
Okay. There is, we have more questions, but I wanted to end on a comment because I think it's how I feel. I think lots of people feel. So Kema, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, Kema or Kema, said, "What a fascinating topic. Thank you for sharing your insight in this information."
Oh, thank you, Emma.
Yeah, it was awesome. Thank you so much, Laura, for presenting. And before everybody goes, we recognize it's the top of the hour and lots of folks are clinicians and have to bail out to see their next client. So just two reminders. Number one, when I close the webinar here shortly, an evaluation will pop up on your screen. If you would take 30 seconds to fill out that evaluation, that would be really helpful. That's a continuing education requirement for Center for Change. All of the information is completely confidential, so please feel free to be candid in your feedback. We then tabulate those results and send those to the CE approval entities. And then about an hour from now or so, you will receive an email from GoToWebinar. It will look similar to the confirmation email you received when you first registered. It will come directly, as I said, from GoToWebinar in about an hour. And in that email will be the link to take the online test. You must take the test in order to receive continuing education credit. Once you pass that online test, the CE certificate will automatically be downloaded to your computer. So look for it in your downloads file if you don't see it on your screen. Sometimes it hides there. All right, our thanks again to Laura for the presentation and to all of you for attending. We so appreciate it. We hope you can join us again next month for the next in our series. And in the meantime, please everybody stay safe and well. Take care.
Thank you.